Greetings, students. Mr. Little here, and today we're going to talk about Chapter 33, Part 3, that is the uneasy peace and the world upheaval after World War I. It's often said World War I was the war to end all wars. Well, if the peace process was any indication, people definitely should have been prepared for a sequel. So, by the end of this presentation, you'll be able to answer the two following questions. How did political and cultural leaders seek to reshape society in the post-World War I world? And two, how did the outcome of World War I represent major political, economic, and cultural continuities in world history? So essentially, we're going to just be covering the aftermath of the war and what came as a result of the conflict. And we're going to go ahead and start by talking a little bit about communism. So before we talk about the Soviet Union and the Russian Revolution, we need to talk a little bit about communist thought from Marx to Lenin. Because last we left off, we had Karl Marx's idea about a workers' revolution. And the idea was that once the workers seize the means of production, the state will cease to exist and will wither away. And so this is a question you sometimes hear is, well, if communism was not meant to have a state, how did you get a communist government? So between Karl Marx and up into the Russian Revolution, there were two big evolutions in communist thought, or amongst those who followed the teachings of Marx and Engels. One was called syndicalism, which was essentially sort of a worker-based organization to advance the goals of seizing the means of production very gradually, although that didn't preclude violence per se. But it's worth noting that some of the early Soviets, that is the workers' councils in Russia, were run by or were run along the model of syndicalism. And so syndicalism, this organizing ideology of communism, played an initial part in the Russian Revolution. The other major contribution to communist thought came from Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, who will be the first leader of the Soviet Union. And in particular, he had a lot of ideas. His whole school of thought is referred to as Leninism, but I want to focus in on one thing, which is called vanguardism. The short version is this: because workers do not adequately understand how communism works or what the goals are, what is necessary is to have a party that can lead the workers into communism, into the communist future that we all desire. And if this sounds a little tyrannical to you, some people hear this and they think, oh, that sounds like, that sounds like a dictatorship. That sounds wrong. It doesn't sound like you're supporting freedom. It's worth noting that, like, the founding fathers thought that too. They saw themselves as the leaders, right? Preparing an American nation for freedom. And the Creoles of Latin America also, you might remember Simón Bolívar's letter, talks about how criollos are in a unique position to lead the people of Latin America into the future by nature of who they are. So this idea of a small elite group leading the people is not actually that different, and it's just applied here in the context of Marxist thought. And this is a picture, by the way, of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. But let's talk a little bit about the Russian Revolution. So you might remember when we left off, it was something called the February Revolution. It actually happened, it's called sometimes in English the March Revolution. It happened in the old Russian calendar, which is behind the current calendar. So in Russia, it actually happened in February. And that's the same way that the November Revolution actually happened in October. But essentially, the February Revolution was a democratic revolution, if you will. It saw the end of the Tsar and the ushering in of a democratic government led by an attorney named Alexander Kerensky. Now, what Alexander Kerensky did was he almost immediately got rid of all of the old Tsarist era policies. He got rid of the secret police. He dismantled all of the restrictions on the freedom of speech. And what happens is numerous organizations that had previously been underground came out and began to organize. And this included the Soviets, or the workers' councils, that were very influential and oftentimes were made up of local workers, local soldiers, local sailors. And so the Soviets began to exercise their influence under this new government. Now, this new government may have survived. It's hard to say, historically speaking, but it made one just fatal mistake, and that is it continued a war against Germany. And to be fair, the Allies put a lot of pressure on Russia not to withdraw from the war. France, in particular, needed Russia to keep fighting to keep Germany distracted in the East. So the new government pledged to fight on, and this was very, very unpopular. And so it resulted in, attempts to overthrow the government, both from the Soviets as well as from militarists who wanted to either restore the Tsar or restore some sort of monarchy. And so this government was sort of, it had a lot of promise, but it was under siege almost from the beginning. And in 1917, mid-1917, the Germans, in an effort to kind of finally get Russia to leave the war, ship Lenin back to Russia. They send him from his exile in Switzerland through Stockholm, and they get him into Russia, where they think he's going to stir up trouble. He and his party, the Bolshevik Party, his vanguard party I was just talking about, they become very influential in the Petrograd Soviet. They lead a coup that doesn't work, but then they come back in October of 1917. They lead a second coup against the provisional government of Alexander Kerensky, and they storm the Winter Palace and effectively tear down the government. How did they do that? Well, they were very popular with the peasants, along with many of the urban workers. They promised an end to the war, they promised a redistribution of land, and they promised bread, which essentially meant they were going to try to make sure everybody got food. Now, how well they were going to be able to keep these promises is another story, but nonetheless, these promises appealed to a population that had been through 3 years of absolute depravity and austerity, with millions of soldiers dead at the front, and the government not seeming to be able to do anything to bring about an end to the war. And so one of Lenin's first objectives was to withdraw Russia from the war, which they promptly did in very early 1918, signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, the Ottoman Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Russia was officially out. Now, this did not mean everything was hunky-dory. So, for example, there were many in Russia who did not support this takeover by this small party of Bolsheviks, and so they had to fight a civil war. They also had a number of allied nations interfering in this civil war and backing anti-Bolshevik forces. So, for example, you had the United States in what is now Vladivostok and what is now Murmansk in the North Sea. Ostensibly, they were there to prevent the Germans from seizing supplies, or maybe to open another front against the Germans, like a new Eastern Front after the Russians had withdrawn. But the Soviets saw this as just trying to sort of strangle their revolution in its cradle before it even had a chance to do anything. And so the Bolsheviks and their allies in the various Soviets around Russia are going to have to fight not only a civil war, but the Allied intervention on their territory for about 3 years. It's going to take until 1921 for this conflict to end and for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, aka the USSR, to be proclaimed in 1921. The revolution was in many ways a product of World War I, in part because of the extreme austerity that the population was forced to endure and a willingness to embrace slightly more radical ideas in order to change their situation, and a real disillusionment with the power structures that be. So one of the reasons that Woodrow Wilson finally agreed to enter the war against Germany was in part the fact that Russia had withdrawn from the war, and in particular that Russia had overthrown their monarchy, and now Woodrow Wilson could claim that in fact he was fighting on the side of democracy. Now, Wilson had a 14-point plan. This is called the 14 Points. Original name, I know. But essentially, it was a new world order that Wilson envisioned for the entire world, with the United States at the center. And in many ways, Woodrow Wilson actually sought to sort of distance himself from the other allies. He was not just leading another nation into war against a rival. He was a crusader, if you will, off to create a new world order. Now, the 14 points are relatively succinct. There are only like 5 major ideas, which include things like open diplomacy, free trade, limited military sizes, self-determination. That covers about half of the 14 points are about self-determination for very specific areas. And then he also had this idea about the creation of a League of Nations. And we're going to talk more about that in a second. But the idea was a permanent international body to keep the peace. Some people looked at this and rolled their eyes and said this was unrealistic or silly. But nonetheless, it brought the Central Powers to the table. When Germany decided to sign an armistice under the pressure of American attacks and the blockade, they expected to be negotiating on the basis of the 14 points. Say what you will about the 14 points being unrealistic or naive, they brought the Central Powers to the negotiating table and effectively ended the war a lot quicker than if they hadn't been published. Now, when the Central Powers, as I mentioned in the last lecture, signed an armistice in 1918, for the next 6 months throughout 1919, a peace conference was held in Paris, in which the United States, France, Britain, and Italy dominated the conference, even though it was made up of all of the Allied powers, all 26 Allied powers, including Japan, who left early after they got into a dispute with the other 4 Allied powers. And at this time, Paris was bustling with various political leaders. All these nationalists from Eastern Europe had shown up in Paris to push for their country's right to self-determination. Polish people, Czech people, Slovaks, Hungarians, Ruthenians, Ukrainians, Serbs, Slovenes, Croats. All these people had shown up at the conference, and some of them had ostensibly been allies of the Western powers, but they were all pushing for self-determination. They wanted Woodrow Wilson to address their particular self-determination issue. We'll talk more about that in a second. But the big thing that came out of the Paris Peace Conference was the Treaty of Versailles, that was dictated to Germany. Now, it wasn't a negotiation. When we say a Paris Peace Conference, it was a conference among the victorious powers, not with the victorious powers and the defeated powers. Germany was forced to accept the treaty. If they did not accept the treaty, the war would resume. In addition to that, Germany would continue to be blockaded until it accepted the treaty. And so effectively, the German representatives had no choice. They had to just go ahead and sign the treaty. And you can go over the treaty yourself. But the big thing about the treaty is that it forced Germany to take sole responsibility for the war. Germany had to admit that it was the sole instigator of the war and pay a very, very large reparations bill that was going to be very difficult to pay under the economic circumstances that were going to come after the war. And then there were some territorial changes, which aren't as important. But the point is that the Paris Peace Conference was dominated by the Big Four, and the Versailles Treaty was a dictated peace. Now, in a certain sense, the peace that Germany signed with Russia, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, was also a dictated peace, and in many ways was much, much harsher than the Treaty of Versailles. I didn't really go over the details of it because it's not important. But there's a lot of talk in historical circles about how harsh the Versailles Treaty was. But a lot of recent scholarship has indicated it was not actually as harsh as it's sometimes made out to be. But nonetheless, it was a dictated peace, and it was not based on Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. And this is going to have consequences down the line. I would like to talk about the Wilsonian movement beyond Versailles, because the double shock of not only the Russian Revolution, the destruction of a 300-year-old monarchy and the foundation of the world's first communist state, but also Wilson's 14 points was a major source of inspiration for resistance of people in colonial societies. So, for example, in India and Egypt, there was an intensification of home rule campaigns. Woodrow Wilson was being talked about by Indian independence and home rule leaders, talking about how his ideas for self-determination would be their justification for freedom from the British. Koreans who had been directly annexed to Japan in 1910 sent a delegation in secret to the Paris Peace Conference asking for a redress of their situation, asking for self-determination to be applied to them. They were promptly ignored, and this ignoring of the delegation they'd sent, combined with the death of the first Korean emperor in 1919, led to something called the March 1st movement, which was a wide-scale set of protests against Japanese rule in Korea that resulted in the death of several thousand Koreans, nonetheless demonstrated the will of the Korean people to exercise self-determination. China also saw a movement known as the May 4th movement, a protest movement that had started against the post-revolution but still autocratic government of China that we're going to talk more about in chapter 35. But essentially, it would kickstart the second phase of the Chinese Revolution. And it was this anger at the right of self-determination being taken away from China and just being given to Japan because Japan happened to be an allied power. All of these groups of people were inevitably disappointed by Woodrow Wilson and the allied powers' actual actions. But nonetheless, the rhetoric of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points and the shock and influence of the Russian Revolution sparked a new wave of anti-colonial resistance around the world. And even more interesting was that this wave of anti-colonial resistance was now international. The Versailles Peace Conference had brought together many of the anti-colonial activists from their various homelands. One of Woodrow Wilson's biggest objectives was the creation of something called a League of Nations. A League of Nations to preserve the peace, an international body to settle disputes that would be permanent, not just a temporary meeting like, say, the Congress of Vienna, but this would be a permanent body where nations could come together, air their grievances, and prevent large-scale wars like what had just been happening. And to the League's credit, it did actually stop a number of small wars. It settled a number of border disputes. And it did help transition out of the World War I era by setting up refugee camps, helping POWs get transferred back to their home countries. And it was the first permanent international body of world countries. And it was based in a neutral nation, which is Switzerland. And so we really should acknowledge the novelty and the originality and sort of the optimism and possibility that did come with the League of Nations. Although we should also acknowledge right off the bat that it had some issues going forward. So, for example, Japan, one of the major allied powers, had proposed including a racial equality clause in the League Charter, that is the founding document of the League of Nations. And this was rejected by both the United States and Australia, particularly for the United States, because they feared having a racial equality clause would force them to give up their anti-Chinese migration policies and or possibly open them up to investigation of their Jim Crow policies in the southern United States post-Reconstruction. So, right off the bat, the League of Nations had some issues. And historically, most historians look at the League of Nations and say it was a, quote, failure because it wasn't able to stop World War II. And if that's your measurement, then yes, the League was definitely a failure. And part of the reason it was a failure was that the United States never joined it. And the United States was the most powerful country in the world at the time. And so the fact that the most powerful country in the world never joined this international body pretty much ended any sort of effectiveness it was really going to have. That and many of the other major powers, such as the Soviet Union, Germany, and Japan, had a negative view of it or didn't take it seriously. It meant that you probably had about half or more of the world's powers not taking this international body seriously. On top of that, it had no enforcement mechanism. So the League could make a ruling, but there was no way to enforce its ruling. The only way to enforce its ruling would be to ask its members to do something about it. And this is going to be a major problem in the 1930s when nobody wants to do anything about the problems. This was brought up when the League was being formed. Woodrow Wilson was asked by the French leader, Georges Clemenceau, if he would be willing to send American soldiers to a remote French colony to help keep world peace. And Woodrow Wilson answered yes, but Clemenceau pointed out that most Americans probably would not want this to be the case. And so the lack of an enforcement mechanism really hampered any ability of the League to effectively preserve world peace. And this is a big criticism of the United Nations today, the League of Nations successor, is that it can't really do anything to enforce what it wants to do. Like, they have peacekeeping forces, but these are not effective military forces. One of the other big critiques of the League of Nations was what's called the mandate system. Now, the mandate system was pretty straightforward. Germany and the Ottoman Empire had a number of territories in Africa, in the Middle East, and in the Asia-Pacific region. And the idea was that these territories, because they had been mismanaged by the Germans and the Ottomans, were not ready to rule themselves. And therefore, it was necessary to transfer them to an imperial power who could help prepare them for home rule. Now, this is all good and fine, except for example, the Arabs of the Middle East, the Chinese, or the individuals in Africa living under German territory. This was a pretty clear continuation of imperialism. And this was a pretty clear denial of the principle of self-determination. No one was asking them if they wanted to be independent. They were being told, you're going to be under the custodianship of an imperial power who's going to help you develop. And it was this recognition that the League of Nations was in some respects just continuing the old practice of imperialism under a new name that led to one of the first anti-imperialist conferences in the world, the Brussels Conference, which would lead to the League Against Imperialism, which would be active for about a decade leading up to World War II. And this is what I meant earlier when I said that anti-colonial activities, anti-imperial resistance was now becoming international. It was no longer about resisting your imperial power just in your colony. It was now about connecting and joining forces with other anti-imperial activists from around the world. That is perhaps one unintentional legacy of the League of Nations. So in general, you should know that the map of Europe was redrawn. In particular, Eastern Europe was redrawn quite a bit. The disappearance of the Austro-Hungarian Empire resulted in the creation of a number of new states, including Czechoslovakia, parts of Poland, Yugoslavia, territorial gains for Romania. The problem with all of these new states is that they all had significant minorities of other people living in them. For example, Romania had large numbers of Hungarians, and Yugoslavia and the Czech Republic had large numbers of Germans living in them. And so this really raised the question of, who gets to decide the self-determination? It's all good and fine to talk about self-determination, but when it comes down to it, who really gets to make the decision? And of course, sometimes the drawers of the maps just straight up ignored self-determination for political or military reasons. So for example, Austrians and Germans speak a very similar language and are very close culturally. And at the end of World War I, Austria wanted to join Germany, but the Allied powers said no. They did not want to risk empowering Germany. And so they denied its right to self-determination on political grounds. Now, remember how I said that the Treaty of Versailles actually wasn't that harsh? And the truth is it wasn't. Germany only lost I think 10% of its territory. It wasn't arguably that much, but the fact that Germany had never been invaded and the fact that Germany was still technically occupying parts of France and Belgium when that treaty was signed made it seem to German leaders like there had been some sort of betrayal, like some sort of backroom deal that had cost them their victory, that the German military had never been defeated, but had been betrayed by politicians, right? Had been betrayed by the insiders. Stop me if any of this sounds familiar. Now, of course, this conveniently ignores the fact that the German military was in a full-scale retreat from France at the time that the armistice was signed. But this legend, this stab in the back or betrayal legend, is going to have a really big impact later on down the road. And of course, just because these new states were created did not mean that everything was hunky-dory. So for example, Yugoslavia was created out of all of the Southern Slavic territories that had been Serbia, Montenegro, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But this was a Serb-dominated state, which also included Macedonians, Croatians, Slovenians. It was not necessarily an equitable self-determination, and this is going to have far-reaching ramifications that we'll talk about when we get closer to the end of the course. Now, the map of the Middle East was also redrawn, particularly the Ottoman Empire, which was forced to accept the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, which effectively ended the empire. Like, the empire itself was only allowed to keep a small chunk of territory on its North Black Sea coast. Everywhere else was to be occupied. And the weakened Sultan at the time basically acquiesced and accepted this treaty. However, many Turkish nationalists did not accept this treaty. I should mention, by the way, that the Young Turks who had aligned the Ottoman Empire with Germany at this point had fled. Fun fact, the 3 Turkish leaders who had organized the Armenian genocide would all be assassinated by, get this, Armenians. Funny how history works that way. Mustafa Kemal was a military general who had led the defense of Gallipoli, and therefore he was very well known and very popular with his soldiers. And he led the military resistance to the Treaty of Sèvres, and eventually managed to drive out the British, the French, the Italians, and the Greeks, and establish an independent Republic of Turkey. Now, his Republic of Turkey was going to be different. It was not going to be a modified Ottoman Empire. It was going to be a completely secular republic. And this is where we begin to see the rise of Islamic secular nationalism. And now Ataturk's particular philosophy was called 6 Arrows, and I don't need to get into that. But the point is, he wanted a strict religion and government. So he abolished the caliphate, which was a very drastic move to do. He closed all religious schools. He banned the wearing of the veil in public. He enforced government officials. He made it a rule that government officials had to wear European clothing. He rewrote the Turkish alphabet himself using a Latin script, and he promoted policies of industrialization along Western lines. He essentially sought to do what the Young Turks had been trying to do, which was to create a modern Turkey that looked a lot like Europe. It's also really interesting. Ataturk continues to be a central symbolic figure in Turkish politics and in Turkish culture, but the long-term impact of his legacy is still up in the air. And there are elements within Turkey that would like to see his work undone. Hopefully we'll get the chance to talk a little bit more about that. If we go a little bit further east to what we traditionally know as Persia, there was also a modernization program underway there. So in 1921, the Soviet Union had supported a group of Persian radicals who wanted to overthrow the monarchy. In response, the British supported their own Persian radical who was going to overthrow the monarchy. His name was Reza Shah, and he overthrows the Qajar dynasty in 1921 and sets up the country and sets up a new dynasty. Now, Reza Shah is going to be important because he's going to be the one that changes the name from Persia to Iran in 1933, and he is also going to make attempts to modernize Persia, very similar to Turkey. His results are going to be a little bit different, and we'll talk more about that when we get there. The point is, in the Middle East, the defeat of the Ottoman Empire and the changing geopolitical situation brings into sharp focus the need to modernize and the rising popularity of Islamic secular nationalism, which is different from, say, Jamal al-Din al-Afghani's Islamic nationalism, which was religious. This Islamic nationalism is secular and sees Islam as a cultural part of the state, but not intrinsically entwined with the state. So there are a number of short and long-term consequences we should just really quickly run over. One of which is the Spanish flu. Now, historians are very quick to point out the Spanish flu is not necessarily a direct one-to-one causation from World War I. However, a lot of historians do acknowledge that the mass movement of men for military service all over the world, particularly across the Atlantic and in the Pacific Oceans, probably at least contributed to the outbreak of the Spanish flu, which eventually killed around 30 million people worldwide, more people in certain places like the Pacific region than, say, in parts of Europe or the United States. And wartime definitely contributed to the virality of this virus because it made the populations vulnerable. Doctors and nurses had been called away to war fronts or had been killed in action. And in Germany and Central Europe, for example, the long years of blockade had led to starvation and malnutrition and a vulnerable population that was more susceptible to a virus. And the Spanish flu was a reminder that a global war has global consequences, and that even in the early 1900s, the world was already globalized. The Spanish flu has gained a little bit of popularity in the last year or so with the outbreak of the COVID-19 virus and its spread around the world. And although the COVID-19 virus was nowhere near as deadly as the Spanish flu, it is a nice reminder that there are consequences to living in a globalized world. Even if it seems like a place might be far away on the map, it might just be around the corner in terms of a virus. So some other long-term consequences of the war would be the end of European political dominance in the world. This wouldn't really be complete until after World War II, but essentially the US taking Europe's place as the premier military, political, and economic power. of the world, at least in the second half of the 20th century. The growth of the global anti-colonial movements, as I mentioned earlier, responds to Wilson and the League of Nations. Now, it's not like no one had ever pointed out that colonial nations faced a common struggle. Jamal al-Din al-Afghani had pointed this out as well. But now the experience of coming together at the Paris Peace Conference and being disappointed, whether you were from India or Korea or Vietnam, really catalyzed these movements. So we're going to talk more about that when we get to chapter 35. The first communist state, that is the Soviet Union, would become a source of inspiration for anti-imperial resistance around the world itself. And the Cold War, which we normally date at the 50s, might have actually started as early as 1917 with the Allied intervention into Russia. But we talk more about that when we get to the Cold War. And in general, the sphere of women begins to expand. The economic and political opportunities of women begin to expand for the first time as a result of World War I. Now, this isn't going to result in immediate changes to political situations, but it is the beginning of wider changes to come, such as voting rights, property rights, and employment rights. But we'll really see this come to fruition in the second half of the 20th century. So, one last thing, if this is a topic that interests you quite a bit, I have a few books I would recommend if you'd like to know more. So if you'd like to know more about the Paris Peace Conference, I recommend Paris 1919, 6 Months to Change the World by Margaret Macmillan. If you'd like to know more specifically about President Woodrow Wilson's ideas and their reception around the world, I would recommend The Wilsonian Movement by Ezra Manila. And if you'd like to know a little bit more about how the Russian Revolution was viewed worldwide, then you can check out Red Star Over the Third World by Vijay Prashad. Each of these books is actually very easy to read, and I can't recommend them enough if you want to know more about this very unique time in world history. But with that said, I want to thank you for joining me. You should definitely be able to answer those 2 questions from the beginning of the presentation. My name is Mr. Little, and I'll see you next time.